All right, welcome to the broadcast. Charles Moscowitz here. My guest is none other than Dr. E. Michael Jones, the author of Logos Rising and a whole ton of other books, all excellent, great stuff. The Culture Wars, he's the editor and publisher. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Charles. Good to see you again.
Same here. I'm really enjoying the book. I read it very slowly, 1 or 2 pages at a time, because it's the kind of book you can't breeze through. And it's brilliant. It's important. Um, you don't say a lot about Judaism, which I'm grateful for. The little bit that you do say is the little you do say is not nice, but either way, you focus on the important issue, I think, which is the definition of reality. And I guess I want to start out with the definition of logos as you define it in the book.
Yeah, logos is the Greek word for word. But it's more than that. And so I remember when I was studying Greek, you open up the dictionary and there are column after column of equivalents for that word. And that's why it's an important word, because we simply don't have those equivalents when we use the word. The classic example of this misconception or miscomprehension is the Gospel of St. John. Begins with the sentence, "In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word is God." Well, I don't know what that means. I've said this before. People have written back to me to say, I've read it all my life. I didn't know what it meant either. But if you say, "In the beginning there was Logos," which is what he wrote, "en arche en ha Logos," and you bring all of those columns of equivalents that we don't have in English into the picture, then it starts to make sense. So in the beginning, there was rationality, there was reason, there was an order to the universe, there was language, and there was logos, and logos is God. So in other words, this is what happened at the beginning. That God was there. He's logos incarnate. And the universe is a manifestation of his being, his rationality, and that's why it's a rational creation. Now, the other part is that St. John was obviously taking Genesis as his model, because in the beginning, in that book, we say, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth."
Right.
Okay, so here's the second time around, and now we're talking about a kind of recap, but we're taking it to a higher level.
Well, when I looked at the first sentence in the Gospel of John, that's exactly what I saw. The first sentence in the Torah, what Christians call the Old Testament.
Right.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And that is a core belief of Judaism. Every Jew, every day, every religious Jew, that is, says a prayer that reiterates that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed be the Lord our God, the King of the universe. It's an acknowledgement that God created. King of universe is the same as creator of universe. The creation, which is the universe. Right. And that this is the very foundation of Logos, as you describe it. It's, in other words, that when you talk about proving the existence of God, you point out you cannot create something out of nothing. There
Right.
has to have been a something for there to be another something. I mean, it's a mathematical equation. It's the idea of the zero. The zero cannot be a 1 or a -1. It is separate. It is nothingness. Right. It's a description of the void. And then out of that void comes something. And the only way for that to happen is through God. I mean, there has to have been a supernatural event.
You have to have God. That's the only rational explanation for a beginning, for a real beginning, meaning creation, which means a beginning out of nothing. You have to have God. It's the only rational explanation for a beginning.
Exactly. And it also gets into the very strange separation in the Enlightenment of philosophy and faith with science, which is, I think, a pseudo development, because the idea of a creation by some supernatural means is philosophical and scientific as much as it is religious. Now, as far as, when I also read the book of John's first sentence, it occurs to me, and I got a little bit of a support for this from Dr. Henry Abramson. He's a very good Jewish historian. I heard him interviewed by Tim Flanders on the meaning of Catholic. And he said that the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Torah by 70 rabbis in Egypt in Greek times, done under the Ptolemies. They took the concept of the Shekinah, which is the Hebrew word for the holiness, the presence, the glory of
Right.
God.
Right.
And that's a word that is throughout the Torah. It's the glory of God was on top of the tabernacle. And the first mention of that is in the book of Genesis, when the Shekinah, God breathed the Shekinah into Adam and thus gave him a soul. He gave him consciousness. And the Greek translation of the word Shekinah is logos. And so
Right.
therefore you have the word, because God gave Adam the ability to speak and to identify the creation, the existence. And then he goes on to give names to all of living things. And that's, in a sense, the very first act of humanity on earth. And it sort of defined us, it separated us from all other living beings. And that this is reiterated by John in the New Testament, the word. It's
Right.
the Shekinah, the idea of it's the merge of the expression of the glory of God with, existence, with creation.
Right. Actually, I just did a review of a book by David Hawkes called The Reign of Anti-Logos. And he talks about academe right now, the problems in academe. But he ends up quoting Jacques Derrida, Jewish philosopher, who has a book called Of Grammatology, which is nothing but a long attack on the real presence, which is the other way I would translate Shekinah. He's got this whole thing about how do things become discourse? Is there a real presence? And at the end of it, he comes to the conclusion, no, there's no real presence. There is only language. And then he goes into this thing, well, when did this happen? When did everything become discourse? And I think what he's talking about is the destruction of the temple. Destruction of the temple was what happened. You know this, but I mean, basically, when the temple's gone, what are we going to do? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, well, we'll start a school. And we have synagogues now. We don't have a temple, but we have a synagogue. And I think this is what Derrida is talking about the real presence disappears and everything is now discourse. So it's kind of like a weird, what should I say? A weird take on the Shekinah, which I think you're right. It's logos, but in this instance, I would say real presence. I think that's what we're talking about here.
Well, I don't know a lot about Derrida. I'm not up to that part in your book. I know that
he's a minimal role. He's really not part of the book, but I'm saying that what you have here is a Jew philosopher whose whole life is an attack on the Shekinah and an attack on logos, and he made a whole career out of that in academe here, and that's part of the problem in academe. That's just a side point. Take it wherever you want to take it.
Well, I mean, I think that he was considered one of the fathers of the postmodern times.
Right.
Which is the denouement of belief, and in that sense, I would describe him. I'm not saying literally, but generally as a Sabbatean Jew. He was in rebellion against logos.
That's right. That's
but that's
absolutely
not,
right.
That's not the conventional Judaism that we apply.
No, it has nothing. It's the direct contradiction of what we were just talking about, which is basically about Genesis and creation, right, and God creating something out of nothing. That's right. Exactly the opposite.
Which remains and is still the very core theme and mission of the Jewish covenant and Jewish faith, to know God and to be a light unto the nations for the rest of the world to know God. So then when we all bring ourselves to the point where we do know God, and as such, we understand logos and we understand the synthesis between God and logos, then we can bring about the Messianic age.
Right. That was my hope. I wanted to there was just an instance. One of my Muslim friends sent me this article about Cardinal Sarah showing up in Iran and having interfaith dialogue. And you didn't hear about it because nobody, it didn't go anywhere. How is it ever going to go anywhere? In other words, if you show up and I'm the Catholic and you're the Muslim and we're going to talk, well, all you do is reinforce the fact that you're the Catholic and they're the Muslim, and that's it. It's over. It's the end. Now, I would have gone there and I would have said, let's talk about Logos, because I've done this before. I don't want to get involved in Muslim Christian dialogue. I think it's a waste of time, but I do want to talk about Logos, and let's see where that can take us, because we have a duty to be creatures of Logos, because that's the way God created it. God created us as rational creatures. We have a duty to follow Logos. So let's take up that discussion. And I've done
By
that.
all means. And I think you do an interesting job, by the way, of analyzing Islamic belief as fidist, in that it's everything literally comes from God. There's no separation. There's no, in other words, God is, and in a way, it's sort of also pantheistic as described by Spinoza, in that God is everything. He's in the rocks on the ground, and he's in the ocean, and that everything is predetermined as such, as opposed to the idea that there was a separation. There was at a moment when the supernatural created creation, and thus
there was a whole chapter on Islam in Logos Rising, and I tried to link it to the Trinity. Now, that's Trinity is something you accept by faith. Okay, you can't prove. There's no way you can come to the conclusion that God created the world. You can come to that conclusion. You can come to that with just by reason alone. You can't come to the Trinity at all by reason alone. And so you would think, well, I guess it's optional. Well, it turns out I don't think it's optional, because I think that what happened with Islam is that they got their idea of God, or let's say Christ, from the Nestorian heretics who denied that Jesus Christ was true God. And that had an effect. It had an effect on Islam, and that effect on Islam was compounded by lots of historical circumstances. But the spread of Islam, let's say to Persia, was by military conquest. It wasn't by persuasion. And so I'm in Mashhad, and I meet the Ayatollah Shahrud, who was a very influential guy. He was an advisor to both the current supreme leader and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Very influential guy. Had been sent to Russia to hand a letter to Gorbachev from the Ayatollah Khomeini. First thing out of his mouth is, the Saudis are terrible. This is not Islam. This conflict has come all the way to this day. We still have this conflict between the Arabic conquerors and the Persian conquered people. That's not going to go away. And it goes back to this, let's not put it this way, it's a complicated issue, but I think if we took it back to Logos and we started with Logos and let's talk about that and let's work our way forward, I think we'd have some way of dealing with this issue. That's why I wrote the book.
Okay. I mean, I don't know, is there a comparison between the conflict between not to get off on a sidetrack, the Sunnis and the Shiites and Catholics and Protestants? I don't know, maybe.
Yes. The Shia are Catholics and the Sunni are Protestants, broadly, if you want to put it that way.
Right. And I also discern, and again, I'm not a Jewish scholar and I'm not a rabbinic figure at all, but it seems to me that there is a natural understanding of a trinity within Judaism, and that is that there was a creator of the universe, there is the created universe, and there's the Shekinah, the spirit, the glory of God. And I mean, obviously we don't do it in the context of Christology, but there is still that triune balance. And I think that to a certain extent, Kabbalistic understanding, esoteric Judaism advances that, particularly when the Zohar was published during the Spanish Inquisition, where it literally gave a three-cornered view of the Kether, the king, and how that would break down. So you have that balance, and you have, of course, you talk about, I didn't get to this part of the book yet, I'm really curious about it, and that is about Hegel and his development of the dialectic, which I think, from what I understand, took God out of the picture and created a natural conflict between the thesis and the antithesis, which was then advanced by Karl Marx in his political theories.
Yeah, well, Hegel, to begin with, was a Lutheran theology student. He was in a seminary. He's 19 years old. and the French Revolution breaks out. So he's influenced by the Enlightenment and also by Christian theology. And he's trying to come up to some type of synthesis. And he did, because, there is evidence of the Trinity in nature. Okay, they found it in geometry. You can find it all over the place, evidence in nature. But he saw the dialectic as an example of the Trinity. So you begin with a unity, okay? And then you so unity is one.
Mm-hmm.
This is Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras had some understanding of the Trinity. So you begin with unity, which is the number one, and then you have multiplicity, which is the number two. Now, if you put 1 and 2 together, you get 3. And the 3 is unity in multiplicity, and that's the Trinity.
Yeah.
So it's in Pythagoras, and Hegel was smart enough to understand this. And so he said, well, you can do this in time as well. So you have the unity at the beginning, and then you have multiplicity. And then what is the purpose of the combination of unity and multiplicity? Well, it's a type of synthesis in consciousness. And so all of human history is this development of consciousness along the lines of the dialectic. That's what Hegel did. Great idea. He was on the verge of, it's a real step forward in terms of making Logos understandable to people using an enlightened vocabulary. But as I say in the chapter, there was a problem here, okay? And the problem is, if you want to study the Trinity, that's, high above human understanding. Mm-hmm. And so all the spiritual teachers say, well, contemplation is the way you study the Trinity. In other words, it's kind of like a religious preparation. Well, Hegel was not, he was not involved in contemplation when he was writing the Phenomenology of the Spirit. He was having an affair with his chambermaid. Yeah. And the culmination of all of these things coming together is basically Napoleon shows up. He defeats the army at Jena, the German army at Jena. Mm-hmm. His chambermaid announces that she's pregnant, and he's got to write the prologue and send it off to the printer of the Phenomenology. All of those things come together. And so what happens in this crisis? What does he do? He falls back on what he considers basic Christianity, which is Luther. Mm-hmm. And Luther was involved in the same type of problem. You see the same dynamic in Luther, which is basically a sexual problem disrupting your spiritual synthesis. So Luther, in this instance, after he broke with the church, he was a slave of his passions. He ended up marrying some nun. Mm-hmm. And that's bad. That's bad enough. You both broke your vows. But more serious is when you try and make some type of theology out of your sin, which is exactly what Luther did. So he said, I'm not guilty. It was God who did it. And so Hegel, now we're a step further here with philosophy. He introduces evil into the dialectic. So the second part of the dialectic is evil confronting good, and evil is necessary before the progression of history. And you just wrecked it, because that is not compatible with the Trinity. You cannot put evil into God. There is no possibility of having God and evil. And the only reason you're interested in putting evil into God is because you can't say you're sorry. You can't say you did something wrong, and you can't ask for forgiveness.
They're building up a whole religious system based on their own guilt and their own sense of denying sin and trying to, shift. It's kind of it's used a psychological term. It's a huge case of projection.
Projection is exactly what we're talking about.
They've done, and we could take a look. You do some brilliant work on what Freud was about in that way, and in a way, it underlines the whole postmodern ethos of like that. Kind of like legitimizing, mainstreaming, and justifying sin.
Right. That's exact. And it wrecked what was what could have been a great step forward in the understanding of Logos. Wrecked it.
But it also shows that concepts like the Trinity, concepts like Logos, can be corrupted by people who have an ill intent. And in a sense, the idea of the dialectic in the hands of people like Karl Marx and people today without, when you remove any divine element to it, it just becomes the creation of and the furtherance of conflict between opposite parts as a way to achieve
Right.
something
Well,
else.
that's exactly what Hegel's student said to him. Feuerbach was a student in Berlin.
Yes.
And Feuerbach wrote to him and say, you don't need God for the dialectic. The dialectic functions all by itself, because it became a machine as soon as the second part becomes evil. Okay. And so Feuerbach understood that. And then it was Marx who read Feuerbach, who then decided, well, we'll have dialectical materialism.
Right.
So the dialectic is now material. No, that's wrong. It's the exact opposite. You can't have dialectical materialism. They're contradictory in terms. You can only have dialectic with spirit, with Geist, which is what Hegel said. And that is the movement of Logos in human history. So what happened at this point, after the death of Hegel, you have European thought just sliding into materialism. And Marx was part of that slide.
And the Hegelian dialectic was also advanced in the field of science by Darwin, who viewed the crashing of the species as creating this new, species. I mean, that whole theory is based on this idea that life somehow miraculously emerged out of what he called the little warm pond. I mean, it's about as mystical as anything that they accuse us of believing in. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Now,
Go ahead.
I want to go back to just a little insight into St. John, the gospel writer. According to Talmudic legend, rabbinic legend, and again, I don't know if I'm not a Talmudic expert here, but it gets to some of the issues of the difference, the conflict between Judaism and Christianity. According to rabbis, and I think that it's part of a discussion that is in the Talmud, St. John was an early Christian believer in Jesus who would go to the synagogue and proselytize. And the rabbis, in response to that, put a little extra piece of language on the prayers, which would call out proselytizers. It would say, do you believe, I don't know the exact wording of it, but my understanding is that it's still there. And it basically, if you said this prayer, it would mean that you would have to denounce Jesus. And so the proselytizer, the believer, would not be able to say it. Then they would be identified and they would be banned from the synagogue. And there was bitterness, and that created a conflict. Right. And that St. John was one of those people who was banned from the synagogue because he did not say this prayer.
Right.
And so he looked back with anger at Judaism because of that. And a lot of the anger that's in the Gospel of John is based upon his rage at Judaism for his being kicked out of the synagogue. Now, I'm not,
sour grapes. The whole Gospel of St. John is sour grapes.
No, it's not all sour grapes. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that some of the business about, some of the very angry stuff in there about Judaism might be that, and it reflects the conflict at the time. And I think that the rabbis also showed a lot of fear and remorse in a way about putting in that language, because they knew that there was going to be a negative consequence to it. And they were fearful of that. They didn't want to alienate people, but at the same time, they did not find it tolerable that people were coming into the synagogue and interrupting their services and, in a sense, overthrowing what they believed to be Logos.
Yeah.
So you had the beginnings of the conflict that continues on to this day.
Right. You're absolutely right. A better example is St. Paul, because we know exactly more about his background than St. John, and we know more about the conflict from St. Paul as well. Mm-hmm. So the point in terms of my book is that basically at a certain point, Paul couldn't preach in synagogues anymore.
Right.
It's that simple. We know who you are. You're not allowed in. Go someplace else. And so he had this vision of some guy beckoning him from across the Aegean. And so he left. He went to Greece. Now, he was capable of doing that because he spoke Greek. Mm-hmm. St. Peter could not do that. St. Peter was stuck in Jerusalem. That's it. And they had their own conflict about how much of Judaism are we going to bring into the new religion.
Right.
Do we have to? Do the new believers have to get circumcised? Do we have to abstain from eating pork? Blah blah blah. They had a big, basically toe-to-toe battle, and St. Paul won. And at this point, he heads off to Greece. And at this point, I'm saying that he had to have a new explanation. So if you have the old, like the St. Matthew explanation of Jesus, who is Jesus? Well, he's the son of Joseph, and Joseph, blah, 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 all the way back to a Jewish genealogy.
Sure.
Well, you go to Greece, nobody's going to know who these people are. So you have to have a new beginning. Well, he didn't. So he went to the Areopagus, which is a Greek philosophical society. He had come from Ephesus. St. John was in Ephesus, and he gave the Ephesus speech at the Areopagus. Basically, Ephesus was a place where they worshiped Diana. She's this grotesque figure with all these breasts. The silversmiths made a lot of money. The whole economy revolved around building idols, and he gave a speech against idols. Well, they weren't idol worshipers. They were philosophers. And so he gives the, like the elevator speech to the philosophers, and he says, well, this guy, Jesus, he's important, and he rose from the dead. Well, they said, okay, oh, he rose from the dead, huh? Well, we'll talk about that some other time. And they all walked out. And for 500 years, there was no church in Athens. So I'm saying that St. John knew this, and he came up with a new introduction, which is basically, in the beginning, there was Logos. And Logos is God. Now, if he had said that, he would have had a discussion on his hands.
Right.
But he didn't. And I'm saying that was the whole new movement. So you're right. They had to break with the synagogue. They were expelled from the synagogue.
Right.
And so they left the synagogue behind, and they went to talk to the bigger Greek world in language that the Greeks could understand.
Right. And it's sort of, in a way, it was frankly, a form of Judaism that could be understood by the Gentile world. And
this brings up an important issue. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
The true identity. What is the true identity of the Jew? Now, I've dealt with this in the Jewish revolutionary spirit, but the true identity of the Jew is based on the Torah.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we're not going to argue about that.
No.
Okay. So the only question is Jesus the fulfillment of the Torah or not? And there are Jews who said, yes, he is.
Right.
And they accepted that. It's not a question of, are we going to repudiate the Torah? No, we're not. There's a group called Marcionites who said that the Old Testament was written by the devil. Well, that was rejected by the church as a heresy. Obviously, the church was based on this, but obviously there's something new here in the person of Jesus Christ. And it divided the Jews between those who accepted Jesus as the fulfillment of the Torah and those who rejected Jesus, saying that he was not that fulfillment, that it's something else. We're going to wait for the Messiah to come in the future. Exactly. That was a conflict.
That was the conflict. That's still the conflict in a way.
It is still the conflict. You're absolutely right.
Although I just would hasten to note that Judaism does not exist as a reaction to Christianity. It's not a rejection of anything. It's its own organic, dynamic belief in the covenant of Sinai. And that the other thing I want to ask is that this is, again, Talmudic, and again, I'm not an expert here, but there's information in the Talmud that indicates that St. Paul, when he was in Antioch, and he was having this very debate that you're talking about, what should we tell people they have to be kosher? You know, I mean, he wanted to do an outreach to the Gentile world, and he got into a big argument with the Antioch early Jewish community, which was the Christian Jewish community at the time. And they said, you're going to have to go back to Jerusalem and talk to St. James, who was the head of the church. He was Jesus' successor. He was, I think, Jesus' brother, if I'm not mistaken, and that he was essentially the head of the church for something like 30 years. And he was a devout Jew also, besides. And so Paul goes back to Jerusalem. He meets James and his group. And they eventually came up with the solution, I guess, in that you can go forth, preach to the Gentiles. You don't have to observe Jewish specific laws because the Gentile world is not obligated to do that. But the only thing you need to remember is that you have to inculcate the Noahide covenant into the faith so that all of mankind will be in accord with the first covenant between God and mankind, with which represents Noah and the rainbow and all of that. And that there was, the rabbis of the Talmud, and it was more codified later, basically synthesized 7 principles in the Noahide covenant. And they're not Jewish principles. They're general universal principles that have to do with, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't murder, you shouldn't, there should be a separation. In a way, it establishes secular government, because it says you have to have a separation of government, like the judges have to be separate. I mean, that goes to the story of Jethro with Moses in Sinai. And you can't be cruel to animals. I mean, there's 7 basic principles. And so that way, Paul could go forth on his evangelistic mission and convert the world, because it inculcated that covenant. What do you think?
I think that the Noahide laws are the Jewish interpretation, and the church is not going to accept the Talmudic interpretation of anything. They have their own commission. They don't have to borrow it from the Jews. I get it from both sides here. I get guys who are telling me, okay, why should I become a Catholic? That's just Judaism. They're all, it's run by Jews. Jews control the Catholic Church, blah, 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 blah. No, there was a difference. I said, look, if you go back there, obviously this grew out of the Hebrew people. Obviously it grew out of that, but you're missing something. There was a huge conflict here, a huge type of course correction that took place. And one of the fundamental aspects of this is that the Jewish interpretation as of then is new. First of all, it is new. Judaism is a religion that is newer than Christianity. It took place after Christianity. I'm talking about the synagogue, the creation of the synagogue that we've already mentioned, the creation of the Talmud, which all took place after the crucifixion. And they're saying this Judaizing, or what do you call it? This Judaic interpretation is no longer normative. Those people don't have the authority to tell us what is the basic principles. It's not going to work that way. We can come together. I mean, there's a tradition in Catholicism where we'll say, well, reason can achieve a lot. So let's talk about the natural law. What can we achieve by reason? And I think you can come to reason to something like, well, murder's bad. Murder's wrong. Okay. And then you could take it another step and say, well, even if this is a creature in the womb, it's still a human being and it's still wrong. So abortion's wrong. And you can argue this way. I think you can argue this way according to what you would say is a neutral middle ground, which is Logos. That's what I'm saying. Some people call it the natural law. There are people who say that the natural law, that's just crypto-Catholicism. There are a lot of people who talk that way. I'm saying no. The whole point of this book is there's lots of agreement that we can reach if we begin the discussion with Logos. That's the point of the book.
Okay. And by the way, I don't agree with you that Judaism is new and that it emerged after the destruction of the Second Temple. I mean, and I also, Jewish understanding of our scriptures, and they are our scriptures with regard to Jesus, are very different than Christian understanding. And that's something that there's a lot of work on that going back millennia.
I said, now wait a minute. When you say our scriptures, what scriptures are you referring to?
Well, what Christians call the Old Testament.
Well, I don't
That's
agree with
our
that.
book.
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, fine.
I don't agree with that.
All
I'm saying
you agree that it is our book, though, don't you?
No, I don't agree with that at all.
All right.
The Talmud is your book. I fully concede that the
Torah
Talmud is your book.
I mean,
the Torah, no, the Torah is not your book.
Well, then why do we have, when we go to synagogue on Shabbos, there's not a Talmud up in the Ark. We take out the Torah, we read the Torah, we honor and revere the Torah, and we talk about the Torah. The Talmud is just basically a study guide to support the Torah. It's not the Torah. It's not at the same level. The Torah is our book.
I agree 100% with what you're saying. The Talmud is not on the same level as the Torah. I'm saying you have no right to claim the Torah as your book, because the Torah is the common property of, let's put it this way,
Of all mankind.
it's the common property of those two groups of Jews that I talked about at the
Okay.
beginning.
All right.
There are Jews that accepted Jesus Christ, and there are Jews who rejected him. And the Torah is the common property of those two groups of people, and it's the rightful property of the Jews who followed Jesus Christ. So
Well,
I'm telling you right now, we as Catholics cannot relinquish Jewish ownership to the Torah, to the Old Testament. We cannot do it.
Jews cannot relinquish ownership of our Torah. But look, I mean, you're right in that it's a common book of both faiths, but it's our story. It's, we are content that it's universal, and the themes in it are universal, but it is the story of the Israelites and the Jewish people and our struggle with God. And also that modern Judaism did not emerge after the Second Temple. I mean, the two strains of Judaism did, that being Christianity and Judaism. But in the broad sense, Talmudic Judaism, I would suggest, started with King Josiah in the Kingdom of Judah, when he brought forth the book with his prophets, and he read them publicly, and the people came back to God. And then after the Babylonian exile, when the Emperor Cyrus, who is called Messiah, by the way, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, in writing gave a decree saying the Jewish people should go back to Judea, reestablish their commonwealth under Persian control, and rebuild their temple. I mean, the entire document is literally in that book, and that is part of the New Testament. That is the beginning of Judaism in the modern sense. That is when you started to have the rabbis, who eventually became known as the Pharisees, start to develop, in a way, what we would today call a school system. They began to develop shuls. I mean, the word shul is school, where people would study the Torah, where they would come together in a minyan and pray. You did have the temple worship, but the temple worship was separate, and eventually the temple worship was less and less important in the Jewish constellation, mainly because it was controlled by the Sadducees, who were pro-Roman and who were pro-Greek, and who were not particularly disposed toward the moral.
First of all, it did not become less important. You could not fulfill the Mosaic covenant without a temple. You cannot do it. And when the temple was destroyed, that time it was destroyed and it was rebuilt. The last time it was destroyed, it never got rebuilt. And that's when the Shekinah disappeared. So Jacques Derrida is right. The Shekinah did disappear. Okay.
No.
Now, I want to go back to the beginning here. We always have this conflict here. Anytime we come into a discussion between Jews and then not Jews.
Right.
Okay. Now, from the outside, both groups would claim that there are Jews. I'm saying that there is now this dual identity here. Okay. The dual identity began with the arrival of Jesus Christ and the separation that we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. It's gone up to this day, so that you have Jews on the one hand who are trying to be faithful to a covenant that they can't be faithful to anymore, because there's no temple, so you can't fulfill the requisite practices. And you got a group of Jews, let's say epitomized by Jacques Derrida, who are rabidly anti-logos in the most extreme ontological sense of the term. And I'm saying this is this dual identity that I am trying to deal with here. Okay. And I'm saying, so people will call me an anti-Semite, okay? Because anytime you disagree with a Jew, you get called an anti-Semite. Anytime you criticize a Jew, you get called an anti-Semite. And that's why I'm always grateful that we can talk, because you're not like those Jews, okay? Right. So we can talk about this dual identity. I mean, do you admit that there is a dual identity?
I admit that. Oh, you mean within Judaism?
Yes.
No, I think there's one identity in Judaism, and that is faith in God and faith in the covenant of the Torah. And that we, as far as the temple itself goes, yes, the temple was destroyed. It doesn't mean that the Shekinah has disappeared from the Jewish people. Obviously, it didn't. As from my perspective, we have continued worship. We don't have the literal sacrifice of the lamb, but we have kosher, and we have means by which we pray that is a substitute until the temple is rebuilt. We do have, and this is, we have, if you look at the, I don't know if you studied the Jewish prayer book at all, but it has an intricate system by which we continue, in a way, an indirect worship at the temple. And we pray for the day when the temple is rebuilt, and
Right.
in fact, the creation of the state of
Right.
Israel.
Right.
And
I
the taking
I
back
think
of Jerusalem is a step in
right.
that direction.
I at this point I'm agreeing more with Jacques Derrida than I am with you.
Okay.
Okay, but I mean, that's I think that's as far as we can take that. So let's get
Okay,
back to
fine. And by
let's
the
get
way,
back to Logos.
let's get back to Logos. Let me just say that I also understand what you're talking about the revolutionary Jew. I mean, that's also true. That's not that's a heresy in Judaism. Just as much as
Let me just say that the second edition of the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit is coming out, and I've been confronted for over the past 11 years with instances where I'm going to talk about. I'm just drawn into a discussion like the Armenian genocide. I got a call from a guy wants me to go to Armenia. We need to talk about. We need to talk. They'll be happy to see you. And then COVID arrives, so I don't go. So, but I wrote an article anyway. So I start looking into it. You cannot explain the Armenian genocide without reference to the revolutionary Jew. You cannot do it.
All
and
right.
this conformed. I'm talking about people like Parvus.
No,
Crucial figure. What happened here is that both the Young Turks and the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks, which are the Armenian revolutionary groups, they both ended up going to the same universities, and they picked up the Jewish revolutionary spirit. Literally, it was Noahide, the group that gave us Lenin and all these people.
I wasn't really prepared to get into that today, although I will touch on what I've studied a little bit. But before I do, the revolutionary Jew is as much a heretic to Judaism as the Cathars were a heretic to Catholicism, or for that matter, the Reformation or the Hussite movement. I mean, these are not.
I'm agreeing with you.
Okay.
I absolutely agree with you. What I'm trying to say is that there is this dual identity that we really have to deal with here. And I'm saying there are two identities out there. There are two Jewish identities. There's one that is trying to maintain the connection with the tradition, and there's another group that is completely repudiated any connection.
And I've done a lot. I've written about this in several of my books. It's the heresy of the false Messiah Shabtai Zvi, and what that did to Judaism was very corrupting. Right. And that those are the people today who, in a way, control the high ground of Jewish culture in the same way that a Hellenized group of Jews controlled the high ground at the time of the Maccabees. And the Maccabean rebellion was to overthrow them.
Look, I was in Mashhad with Rabbi David Weiss. He's part of Noahide Carter. You probably don't agree with them, but I said basically, look, if all the Jews were like Rabbi David here, we wouldn't be here. Yeah, we wouldn't be talking with each other right now, because it's the Jewish revolutionary spirit, in particular neoconservatism and the invasion of Iraq and this whole disaster over there, that brought us together. So we're not talking about that group of people. No, we're talking about the Jewish revolutionary spirit. And all I'm saying is that over these 11 years, I wanted to thank you for mentioning it, but basically it's a category of reality. It's not something Mike Jones made up. It's out there. No, it's out there.
There is a revolution within Judaism. It's a fascinating subject. I mean, if it was for Weiss, we wouldn't have Israel today either. I want to address briefly, since you brought it up, Mike, the business of the Armenian genocide. You mentioned this group of the secret society in Russia, Volya.
Noahide Volya.
Now, I did a little research on them, and first of all, your definition of the Jewish revolutionary spirit in your book, which I read, you're mostly talking about non-Jews, or you're talking about people who might have had one Jewish grandparent. I mean, and that they are revolutionaries, they're communists. And you're describing that as the Jewish revolutionary spirit. And I understand why, because we rejected Jesus, therefore we're in rebellion. But in the literal sense, they're not particularly Jewish. And as far as the Novalia group goes, they actually were not Jewish in the beginning. I mean, the original members of that group were disaffected Russian aristocrats who drew a lot of their inspiration and their philosophy from Italian communists, like Bruno, I think his name. I did some research on this, who, I mean, I think nominally were Catholic. And it was only later, and they were anti-Semitic, I may add. I mean, Bakunin was an anti-Semite. He was talking about the
Right.
Rothschilds.
Trotsky was anti-Semitic too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and he had Jewish background.
A Jew, you can be a Jew and an
Well,
anti-Semite
he
at
had
the same
Jewish
time.
background, but he was, he was about as Jewish as we could name some Catholics calling themselves Catholic who are not.
So let me say first
The point
of
I'm
all,
making here is that it was only later, in later stages, that Jews were entering into that. It was not.
You're right. You're right. The revolutionary movement in Russia split. And there was the Back to the Land movement, and the Jews were part of it. They weren't the whole thing. They were part of it. So they go to the peasants, and they couldn't talk to the peasants. As soon as the peasants saw they were Jews, they report them to the police, and they got nowhere. You can't talk. Okay. At that point, they split off to the revolutionary movement, which was engaged in terrorism. Okay. Richard Pipes is the one who called Narodnaya Volia the first terrorist organization in the world. It was predominantly Jewish, which comes to the second point. There has never in human history been a group that has been exclusively Jewish as a revolutionary group. It's never happened. So I didn't call this, I called the book The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Okay. It's a spirit that you don't have to be Jewish to adopt the spirit.
Well,
so you have people like Cromwell. Was Cromwell a Jew? No. Did he have the Jewish revolutionary spirit? Yes, he did. The Puritans were Judaizers. They were Christians who wanted to be like Jews, wanted to act like Jews, wanted the benefits of being Jews. That's why I called it the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
Well, you ascribe any revolutionary movement as being Jewish because you describe Judaism as revolutionary because we rejected Jesus. Isn't that in a nutshell?
No, Louis Israel Newman wrote the book on this. The footnote is in there, and he said Jews were involved in every single revolutionary movement in Europe. That's his testimony. That's not mine. Rabbi Louis Israel Newman.
Fine. They might have been involved. I don't know if they were involved in every movement, but they were not there.
Well, he said that.
All right. Therefore, but my point is that these are Jews who are heretics. I mean, they rejected Judaism as part of it. In a way, they took Jewish ideas and they perverted them to fit a revolutionary mold. Like example,
didn't we just talk about?
Yeah,
we talked about this at the beginning. I'm saying there are two groups of Jews out there. The Jews that are trying, in some sense, like Rabbi David, who's trying to follow the Torah in spite of the fact that they got no temple and you can't fulfill the Mosaic covenant anymore. And there are Jews who are involved in what we've called the Jewish revolutionary spirit, which is a complete and total rejection of Logos. Whether it's a politically motivated rejection of Logos of the type you saw in Trotsky, or a more philosophical rejection of Logos of the type you see in Jacques Derrida. That's what this is about.
All right. No, I think that's fair enough insofar as that, first of all, the Jews who are following the Torah are not doing something that's artificial. They are part of the covenant. They are continuing the covenant. That's obvious to me.
You cannot fulfill the covenant without a temple. You cannot fulfill the covenant.
I disagree. The issue of the revolutionary element in Judaism, that's also true, but I would suggest that they are heretic into the same way that you could point to the same revolutionaries that call themselves Christians, like the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt and Satanism. I mean, these are Christian movements. Anyway, Mike, let's, we should probably wrap it up. Interesting, amazing book. I am up to the chapter about Hegel. I'm looking forward to reading that. I admire your work immensely, and I'm looking forward to talking with you again when you release the new edition of the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit.
Great. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Charles. If all Jews were like you, we wouldn't have problems today, okay?
Well, you're never going to get that, because when you get 3 Jews, you have 3 arguments.
3 Jews, you have 4 different opinions until I walk into the room and I unite the Jewish people.
Well, then maybe in a sense you could be a crypto Jew. I don't know. All right, Mike, thank you so much again for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye.